the Zero, they realized something profound. Japan's technological triumph was built upon a dangerous faith in perfection. Koga had been expected to achieve mastery in an aircraft that left no room for mistakes. One miscalculation, one gust of wind, and death followed. That insight would guide the Americans toward a very different philosophy of design. The tactical angle for months, Allied pilots had been trying to guess how the Zero could outperform them so completely. They tried to mimic its turns, dive after it, climb with it, and paid with their lives. But now, for the first time, naval tacticians could stop guessing and start calculating. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders and his team began a series of test flights at Naval Air Station North Island. Every takeoff was a mission into the unknown. Sanders would push the aircraft to its limits, reporting meticulously on its behavior at different speeds and altitudes. He discovered that the Zero was not invincible. It was simply unmatched within a narrow envelope of combat conditions. Its extreme lightness gave it an advantage in slow-speed dogfights, allowing it to outturn heavier American fighters. But that same lightness became a liability at high speeds. Above 200 knots, the controls stiffened dramatically. The ailerons, the flaps that controlled roll, became nearly immovable. Sanders's reports shattered the myth. The Zero is dangerous only if you fight it on its own terms, he noted. At high speeds, it loses nearly all responsiveness. This single observation would reshape Allied air combat tactics across the Pacific. Pilots were trained to avoid turning engagements. Instead, they would dive, strike, and climb, using energy, not agility. Never turn with a Zero became the new mantra. The psychological shift was immediate. Where once Allied pilots had feared the Zero's ghost-like maneuverability, now they understood its vulnerability. Knowledge became weaponized, invisible but decisive. And as these flight reports circulated among designers at Grumman Aircraft, they saw an opportunity to build a plane that could not only survive against the Zero, but dominate it in every measurable way. Because to win the skies over the Pacific, America didn't need a better version of Japan's fighter. It needed its opposite, a beast that could take punishment, strike hard, and keep flying. That beast was already taking shape in blueprints and aluminum frames at Grumman's Long Island plant. Its name would soon echo through the Pacific like a thunderclap: the F-6F Hellcat. But before it was built, one final series of tests would unlock the Zero's deepest secrets and expose exactly how to destroy it. The technological angle at Grumman's factory in Bethpage, New York. Engineers gathered around the data pouring in from Eddie Sanders's reports. Each page detailed something the Americans had never fully grasped before: the anatomy of Japan's aerial weapon. They studied the Zero's feather-light construction. Its airframe was built from a special aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, lighter yet stronger than anything in use by the U.S. Navy. Every component was designed for maximum efficiency. Even the rivet spacing, even the hollowed control levers. It was elegant, but also dangerously fragile. When the engineers examined the engine mounts, they noticed something extraordinary. The entire plane was balanced around its center of gravity so precisely that even with minimal thrust, it could glide with uncanny stability. That explained why Japanese pilots could maneuver with such grace at low speeds. But it also revealed a flaw. The Zero's power plant, the Nakajima Sakai engine, lacked the raw horsepower to sustain energy in vertical climbs. The Americans realized they didn't need to copy the Zero, they needed to outpower it. The solution would come in the form of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp engine, a 2,000-horsepower monster capable of lifting heavier armor and weaponry without sacrificing speed. Grumman's engineers began modifying their in-development fighter. originally the F-4F Wildcat's successor. What started as a moderate upgrade rapidly transformed into a complete redesign. The wings were strengthened, the fuselage expanded, and the cockpit raised for visibility. The Zero had taught them that visibility meant life, and survivability meant victory. But perhaps the most decisive lesson was psychological. The Zero was designed for offense, not endurance. American fighters would reverse that doctrine entirely. They would be built to take damage, to climb higher, to dive faster, and to bring their pilots home alive. The Hellcat was not meant to dance in the sky. It was meant to kill efficiently and survive mercilessly. As the first prototypes of the F-6F rolled out in June 1942, the influence of the Akutan Zero was everywhere, from its reinforced skin to its thick, bulletproof glass canopy. Test pilots noted how it felt heavy compared to the Zero, yet incredibly stable at speed. It was not an agile duelist. It was a predator. The engineers knew, in a straight climb, a Zero might still outturn it, but in a dive, the Hellcat would leave it helpless. The strategic angle, while Grumman perfected its design. Naval commanders rewrote the rulebook for air combat across the Pacific. Intelligence briefings emphasized the Zero's newfound weaknesses: poor roll rate, fragile construction, and sensitivity to high-speed control. Training manuals were updated, flight instructors retrained. The new doctrines spread like wildfire. Don't fight the Zero's war. Fight your own. This shift represented more than just tactics. It was the psychological emancipation of Allied pilots. For months, they had flown in fear of the mysterious Japanese aircraft that could appear, strike, and vanish. Now they flew with a plan and a purpose. The intelligence gathered from the Akutan Zero reached not just the U.S. Navy, but also the Army Air Forces and even the Royal Australian Air Force. Allied engineers adapted their own aircraft designs, integrating what had been learned: lighter control responses, improved visibility, and stronger airframes. But nowhere did this knowledge matter more than in the creation of the F-6F Hellcat. Grumman's test teams worked around the clock, integrating the Zero's lessons into every detail. They even simulated mock dogfights between the captured Zero and prototype Hellcats, measuring performance under identical conditions. The results confirmed what Sanders had already proven. The Zero was deadly only when fought at slow speeds. The Hellcat, with its superior power, could dictate the terms of engagement. It could dive faster, climb higher, and absorb punishment the Zero could not. By late 1942, the Pacific balance of power was beginning to shift. The first production Hellcats rolled off the assembly line, each one a direct descendant of that captured fighter from Akutan Island. Its DNA carried the story of its enemy, but its purpose was to end that enemy's reign. In every rivet, every engine roar, and every burst of .50 caliber fire, the Hellcat embodied America's greatest wartime advantage: adaptation. Soon, that adaptation would be tested, not in laboratories, but in battle. The time had come to unleash the Hellcat against the very machine that had inspired its creation. And when they finally met in the skies above the Pacific, the results would rewrite the history of aerial warfare forever. Late 1942, Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego. The Pacific wind swept across the runway as Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders adjusted his helmet strap. Before him sat the Akutan Zero, freshly restored, polished, and refueled. Its radial engine ticked with quiet menace, the same sound that had echoed over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Coral Sea. Only this time, the plane bore white U.S. markings on its fuselage. The enemy-turned teacher. Sanders climbed into the cockpit, his gloved hand brushing the worn Japanese controls. He knew he was sitting inside the machine that had defined Japan's aerial supremacy. His mission was not just to fly it, but to expose its soul. The engine roared to life, its propeller slicing the air with a rising whine. As the Zero rolled down the runway and lifted into the California sky, American engineers watched from below, notebooks open, breath held. This was not merely a test flight, it was the turning point of a war fought on wings. From the moment Sanders leveled off, the differences were striking. The Zero responded with astonishing lightness. It felt alive, almost telepathic. The controls moved with the faintest touch. At low speeds, it could turn inside almost anything he had flown. But as the airspeed increased, the illusion of perfection began to crack. At 200 knots, the stick grew heavy. The ailerons resisted movement. By 250, the roll rate slowed to a crawl. "It's like trying to move steel bars through concrete," Sanders would later report. The higher he pushed the throttle, the more sluggish the controls became, a fatal weakness in combat, where speed meant survival. He tested dives next. The Zero could accelerate rapidly but shuddered violently beyond 350 knots. In steep descents, its wings flexed visibly, warning of structural limits. Unlike American fighters, which could dive out of danger, the Zero risked tearing itself apart if it tried to follow. Then came vertical climbs. Sanders pulled the nose upward. The Zero responded smoothly at first, but soon its engine began to strain, its momentum bleeding away. In combat, that stall could be fatal. The famed Japanese agility vanished when gravity took over. The engineers below were astonished. The myth of the invincible Zero was collapsing before their eyes. Sanders's reports over the next weeks confirmed it. The Zero's genius lay in simplicity, but it was also its undoing. Its light frame, so perfect for maneuverability, made it extremely vulnerable to gunfire. One solid hit could ignite the unprotected fuel tanks. Its lack of armor turned every bullet into a death sentence for the pilot. The data was clear. Japan's aerial supremacy was built on fragility. Sanders flew the captured Zero 24 times between September and October 1942. Each flight peeled back another layer of its mystery. His final assessment was clinical but decisive. The Zero has only one advantage: maneuverability. Everything else can be countered by speed, power, and tactics. That statement would ripple across the Pacific. Combat manuals were rewritten. Pilots were trained to engage with energy tactics. Boom and zoom. Dive fast, strike once, and climb away. Never enter a turning fight. Force the Zero to chase, make it overshoot, and attack from above. But the most profound effect was on design philosophy. Grumman engineers, led by Leroy Grumman himself, studied Sanders's data and immediately began reworking their prototypes. The lessons were integrated directly into the F-6F Hellcat. Stronger wings for high-speed dives, reinforced control surfaces, armor plating behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and above all, that mighty 2,000 horsepower engine that turned the aircraft into a flying fortress. By early 1943, the first operational F-6F Hellcats were delivered to Navy squadrons in the Pacific. Their pilots were briefed with one phrase: "This is the answer to the Zero." Within months, the transformation was visible. In the skies over the Solomon Islands, carrier-based Hellcats began engaging Japanese fighters for the first time. The results were stunning. What had once been one-sided duels became systematic victories. American pilots could dive faster, turn wider, and climb higher, and still come home. In less than a year, the Hellcat was rewriting the Air War's arithmetic. But its true trial, the battle that would define its legend, was still to come. A confrontation so vast and decisive that it would mark the irreversible collapse of Japan's air power. That moment arrived in the summer of 1944. high above the Philippine Sea. When the Akutan Zero finally arrived in San Diego, it was treated not as wreckage, but as treasure. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had the damaged aircraft crated, shipped, and unboxed like an archaeological find. Every dented panel, every bullet hole, every broken control cable was photographed, tagged, and catalogued. At North Island Naval Air Station, mechanics and engineers gathered around the plane in silence. Before them stood the legend that had haunted their pilots for months, the Mitsubishi A6M-0 in flesh and metal. Until now, Allied intelligence had relied on sketchy reports from the battlefield. But this was the real thing. The first challenge was to restore it. The crash at Akutan had mangled the landing gear, smashed the propeller, and bent one wing. Yet the fuselage, engine, and cockpit controls were largely intact. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, the Navy's team began a painstaking process of reconstruction. Replacement parts were fabricated by hand. The original Sakai 12 engine, delicate, precise, and unfamiliar, was cleaned, lubricated, and reassembled piece by piece. When the day of the first test run arrived, everyone held their breath. Mechanics tightened the last bolts, engineers stepped back, and Sanders climbed into the cockpit. The aircraft was still painted in Japanese colors, its red circles a haunting reminder of the Pacific skies. As the engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, the hangar shook. The once feared Zero had come back to life, not for Japan, but for the United States. Flight tests began soon after. Sanders was an experienced test pilot, but he understood the weight of what he was about to do. "We were about to meet our enemy face to face," he later said. The first flight was cautious. As the Zero lifted off from the runway, its lightweight design immediately became apparent. It handled with ease, smooth, responsive, almost graceful. In the air, it turned with uncanny precision, banking tighter and faster than any American plane Sanders had ever flown. Its low stall speed and high climb rate made it seem alive, agile, almost predatory. But the more Sanders flew it, the more its weaknesses began to reveal themselves. Beneath its elegance lay fragility. The aircraft was lightly built, its skin thin as aluminum foil in some places. There was no armor to protect the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its very strength, lightness, was also its fatal flaw. One burst of gunfire, one lucky hit, and it could be reduced to flames in seconds. Over weeks of testing, the Navy documented every characteristic in detail. The Zero's top speed was lower than expected, barely over 320 ft. Its dive performance was poor, and its ailerons stiffened at high speeds, making it difficult to roll. The Zero dominated at low speeds and in tight dogfights, but if an American pilot stayed fast, climbed high, and refused to turn fight, the advantage could be reversed. These findings were revolutionary. For the first time, American pilots could understand not just what the Zero could do, but what it couldn't. They learned to avoid horizontal turns, to dive instead of climb when attacked, and to strike from above with speed and surprise. Reports were circulated to every Allied airbase in the Pacific. Training manuals were rewritten. Pilots were briefed on new tactics derived directly from the Akutan Zero's performance. The once invincible Japanese fighter had been decoded, dissected, and neutralized. But the real impact went beyond tactics. It transformed American aircraft design. Engineers at Grumman and Vought studied the test data and incorporated it into the next generation of U.S. fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. These planes were faster, heavier, and stronger than the Zero. They could out-dive it, out-climb it, and survive hits that would have turned a Zero into ashes. By late 1943, the tables had turned. The same skies once ruled by Japan's aces now belonged to the Americans. In the battles over the Solomons and the Marianas, The Hellcat, built on the lessons of the Akutan Zero, achieved kill ratios as high as 13-1, and yet, amid the triumph, there remained a haunting irony. The key to victory had been handed to the Allies by the death of a single man. A Japanese pilot whose name few Americans ever knew. His sacrifice, unintentional as it was, became one of the great turning points of the air war in the Pacific. The Akutan Zero, once feared and revered, had become the teacher. Through its wreckage, the Allies learned not just how to win dogfights, but how to win the war. By early 1943, the tide of the Pacific War was shifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but the transformation was undeniable. What had once been a desperate struggle for survival was now becoming a campaign of momentum, and the forgotten wreck of the Akutan Zero lay quietly at the heart of that change. The intelligence drawn from its tests spread like wildfire through Allied commands. The U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and even the Royal Australian Air Force received new tactical briefings titled Characteristics of the Japanese Zero Fighter. These were not vague suggestions. They were survival manuals. Pilots were instructed to never dogfight a Zero on its own terms. Instead, they were to use energy, altitude, and discipline. The new doctrine was brutally simple. Never turn with a Zero. Hit once and get out. The old days of swirling, romantic dogfights were over. American pilots now fought with calculated aggression. They climbed high, dove fast, and struck like lightning. The war in the air had become a chess game, and the Zero was no longer the unbeatable queen, but a piece whose moves were now fully known. Meanwhile, at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, New York, engineers were deep in design meetings, referencing the Akutan reports line by line. Chief designer Leroy Grumman and his team had been tasked with creating a fighter that could dominate the Pacific, a plane that combined power, protection, and pilot survivability. The result was the F-6F Hellcat, an aircraft born directly from the lessons of the Zero. The Hellcat was heavier, nearly twice the Zero's weight, but its massive Pratt & Whitney engine gave it astonishing thrust. It carried thicker armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 6 .50-caliber machine guns that could shred through the lightweight Japanese fighters. In pure maneuverability, it couldn't match the Zero, but it didn't have to. It was built to outlast, outgun, and outclimb. When the Hellcat entered combat in 1943, the difference was immediate. Pilots who had once feared Japanese fighters now faced them with confidence. Over the skies of Rabaul, the Solomon Islands, and later the Marianas, the Hellcat tore through formations of Zeros. One veteran pilot later said, "It felt like we were finally fighting with the answers to the test." By the time of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, the results were devastating for Japan. Over 500 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day, most of them Zeros. American losses were minimal. The air superiority that Japan had enjoyed since Pearl Harbor was gone forever. But the Akutan Zero's influence reached even further than the skies. It symbolized a new way of thinking about warfare, one that prized understanding the enemy over simply overpowering him. U.S. intelligence had learned that knowledge, precision, and analysis could change the course of an entire conflict. The Akutan Zero taught engineers to study design flaws and strengths. It taught pilots discipline in combat, and it taught strategists that victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the most informed. For Japan, the Zero's mystique faded into tragic irony. Once a symbol of technological mastery, it had become a relic. Elegant, but outdated. The very qualities that had made it superior, its lightness and agility, became fatal weaknesses against the brutal efficiency of American firepower. By 1945, as Japan's cities burned and its navy lay in ruins, the Zero still flew, but as a shadow of its former self. Many were used in desperate kamikaze attacks, their grace and precision reduced to suicidal plunges. It was a heartbreaking end for what had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And yet, the story of the Akutan Zero endures because it captures something deeper than victory or defeat. It is a story of how knowledge turns fear into mastery, how curiosity dismantles myths, and how even the smallest discovery, the wreck of a single plane on a lonely island, can change the course of history. In a war that spanned oceans and claimed millions, the Akutan Zero was just one artifact. But it reminded the world that sometimes, to defeat your enemy, you must first understand him. The silent plane that once ruled the Pacific had become a teacher, and through it, the Allies learned the most powerful lesson of all. That truth, once uncovered, can become the ultimate weapon. When the guns of the Pacific finally fell silent in August 1945, the wreckage of war stretched across thousands of miles, from the jungles of New Guinea to the burned cities of Japan. The Zero, once the symbol of Japan's airborne supremacy, lay scattered across airfields and beaches, its sleek frame now corroding under tropical rain. But one Zero, the Akutan Zero, lived on in memory, in the minds of engineers, and in the blueprints of a new generation of American fighters. The data gathered from that single captured plane had done something remarkable. It had turned the tide of air combat in the Pacific. Before Akutan, American pilots entered battle with uncertainty. After Akutan, they fought with understanding, with numbers, performance charts, and confidence. When the war ended, the F-6F Hellcat stood tall among the most successful combat aircraft in history. It had claimed a kill ratio of 19-1, destroying more than 5,200 Japanese aircraft, the vast majority of them Zeros. It became the undisputed champion of the Pacific skies. But the Hellcat's dominance wasn't just a story of brute force. It was the culmination of knowledge, of one captured fighter's silent lessons translated into American innovation. Every rivet, every curve of the Akutan Zero had whispered insights into balance, control, and design philosophy. Engineers at Grumman had studied how a lightweight frame could produce agility, how a responsive control stick could improve reaction time, and how thin metal could achieve surprising aerodynamic grace. Yet, they also saw what it cost. The Zero's obsession with speed had left its pilots defenseless. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no forgiveness for error. The Americans took that knowledge and built something that could not only kill, but survive. When the Hellcat entered mass production, the contrast between the two fighters reflected the deeper philosophies of their nations. Japan had pursued perfection in performance. The United States had pursued perfection in resilience. In the end, resilience endured. In the years that followed, the Akutan Zero was remembered with reverence in aviation circles. The original plane, after months of testing, was damaged in a landing accident in 1945 and scrapped. But its legacy lived on through the reports, the flight data, and the tactical doctrines it inspired. In museums and military archives, fragments of its story remain: photographs, flight notes, and the faint memory of the test pilots who had risked their lives flying the enemy's machine. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, who first tested the Zero, often spoke modestly about the experience. He said, "It was just another airplane, but knowing how it flew, it changed everything." And indeed, it did. The lessons from the Akutan Zero reshaped not only American aircraft, but also the mindset of post-war aviation design. Engineers began to understand that analyzing enemy technology wasn't an act of imitation. It was an act of evolution. The idea of reverse engineering became a cornerstone of military innovation in the Cold War that followed. In Japan, the Zero's story took on a different tone. For many Japanese veterans, it symbolized both pride and sorrow. Pride in its engineering brilliance, sorrow in how its perfectionism blinded their leaders to change. The Zero had been an early marvel, but by 1944, Japan's industry could no longer match the scale, resources, or adaptive power of the Allies. Today, a handful of restored Zeros still fly, ghostly silhouettes of a bygone era. Their engines roar in air shows, not as symbols of conquest, but as living reminders of courage, innovation, and tragedy. And each time their propellers spin, they carry the echo of that day on Akutan Island, when an enemy pilot's crash inadvertently changed the course of the war. The story of the Akutan Zero endures because it captures something timeless. It is a tale of unintended consequences, of how a single mistake, a single wreck, can ripple through history. It reminds us that war, for all its destruction, also accelerates understanding. It pushes nations to learn, to adapt, to think differently. And sometimes, the smallest fragments of knowledge, a bolt, a wing, a flight test, can rewrite the destiny of thousands. From the tundra of Akutan to the skies over the Marianas, the legacy of one captured Zero proved that information is the ultimate weapon, and knowledge, once unlocked, can win wars. History often turns not on grand speeches or sweeping armies, but on quiet moments, the crash of a single plane, the curiosity of a few engineers, the courage of one pilot who dares to understand what others only fear. The story of the Akutan Zero is one of those rare intersections where fate and reason meet. A chance discovery on a lonely island became a catalyst for transformation, not only in technology, but in the very psychology of war. The Americans had not just captured a machine, they had captured the essence of their opponent's thinking. From that understanding came evolution. The F-6F Hellcat was not merely a weapon, it was a statement. It declared that the age of myth was over. That skill and strategy could overcome mystique. That precision could defeat perfection. And yet, beyond the engines and the metal, the story holds something profoundly human. Tadayoshi Koga, the young Japanese pilot who died that day, never knew that his final flight would alter history. He was a man following orders, loyal to his country, flying a machine he believed in. In the end, his loss gave his enemy the means to survive and to win. It is a haunting reminder that even in war, knowledge often grows from sacrifice. The Akutan Zero taught the world that superiority is temporary, that innovation is a living process, and that no power, no matter how dominant, is immune to understanding. The lessons it gave through its quiet wreckage echo far beyond the Pacific, into every age that follows. For in the grand design of history, true victory does not belong to those who destroy, but to those who learn. And somewhere, in the cold winds that sweep across Akutan Island, the story endures, the whisper of a fallen Zero, and the truth it revealed to the world.